Salman Rushdie. He's the author of such books as Midnight's Children, Harun and the Sea of Stories, the Satanic Verses. And he is currently the Distinguished Professor of Literature at Emory University and was recently knighted for his service to literature. I think that probably suffices. You seem to all know who he is. So without further ado, Salman Rushdie.
Thank you. All right, thanks. All right, you can all hear okay? Yes. Huh? Yeah, okay. Well, it's getting to be a habit, this Google thing. Hello, Google people. I was just in England. This novel just came out in England a few weeks before it came out here. And one of the things I did was go to this big Google seminar up in the Grove at Watford, just north of London, and talk to another bunch of you. And I think in a week or so, I'm going to be in Mountain View. So I'm Googling across the world right now. But you know, I mean, like everybody else, I'm a big fan of Google. And actually in this book, I've discovered as the internet has got more and more sophisticated, that it's become more and more useful to people like me. I mean, it used to be, you know, the problem of the web used to be that it had enormous breadth and very little depth, so that if you actually wanted to go deeply into something, you often found that the material wasn't easily available. But that's beginning to change, and certainly actually now that I have, as was mentioned, now that I've got an academic affiliation, so that I can penetrate the academic web through, you know, JSTOR and sites like that with my Emory password, that transforms it, because that suddenly means there actually is there are incredible resources available. I mean, for instance, here's a novel set, you know, entirely in the 15th and 16th centuries. And the 16th century in India, the reign of the Emperor Akbar, which takes up basically the whole of the second half of the 16th century in India, there are three primary sources for it, written by contemporary historians. Very, very long books, I mean, almost day-by-day histories of the reign. But they're written, first of all, they're written in Persian. And secondly, as I say, they're enormously long. And so, you know, in the old days, one would have had to go to a university library and sit in a book stack somewhere with heaps of these very complex texts, and wading your way through such translations as were available and making endless notes, which you would afterwards have to try and make sense of. But now, thanks to the web, there's this excellent site called Persian Texts and Translation, which you could go to and gives you full text translations of all these 16th century works. And it means that, you know, you can have on your laptop the page you're writing, and side by side with it, you know, the text that you need to refer to check things. And it saved me, I don't know what, I mean, months and months and months of work to be able to do that. And there were other such instances. I mean, there's a scene in the novel, in the Italian part of the novel, which takes place at the home of the famous Admiral and condottiere, you know, military leader, Admiral Andrea Doria, who is perhaps better known for a ship that sank later on. But, you know, back in the day, he was this legendary Genoese admiral who fought the Barbary corsairs and so on. And it was still there. He built or bought and then extended a beautiful villa right on the sea coast outside Genoa. And I wanted to set a couple of scenes in the book there. And you go on the web and you can find, actually I found very easily by very simple piece of search, a very scholarly article about the building of the villa, who owned it before him, what additions he made, floor plans of the villa, and kind of stories about when he was living there. I mean, that's to say 20 times as much as I needed for the 2 or 3 pages that I was going to set in this place. And so, you know, this is one of the ways. I mean, at the end of this book, there actually is an ordinary bibliography, a book bibliography, but there's also a web bibliography, and it's the first time I've ever felt the need to do such a thing. And it is extraordinary that there were these books or these sites without which the book would have taken maybe twice as long to research, and certainly much longer to write. So that's a very pleasant way in which the present has allowed the study of the past to improve. I mean, it's kind of, I'm aware of the fact that here I am to talk to you about the past when all of you are fixated on the future. But, you know, the two are not as disconnected as you think. Because the thing that I found when I was studying history at university is that, first of all, history is not a fixed thing. I mean, the way in which the past is seen is very much a function of the way in which of the things we're concerned about in the present. You know, if you look at, for instance, the history of the Renaissance, the contemporary history is written in the 16th century, and then you look at the way in which it was seen by historians in the 17th century, the 18th century, the 19th century, and now it's completely different. Because we bring our present concerns to bear on the past, and we see in the past those things which seem to connect with the world in which we now live. You know, so it becomes a way of shining a light on the present to show us that actually we've always been up to this stuff. You know, and frankly, you know, the great constant is human nature, and if we are brutal now, we were brutal then. You know, I mean, if we are, you know, treacherous and untrustworthy now, we were treacherous and untrustworthy then, and you know, good things too. But the point is that since the species that we belong to has always acted in substantially the same way, when you look back at this period, at the period in Italy of the High Renaissance of the Medicis and Borgias and so on, moving a little east, the Ottoman Empire, you know, the fall of Constantinople, the establishment of the Ottoman Empire. East of that, the Safavid Persian Empire, then as now a kind of powerful Shia Muslim world. Beyond that, an area which was in those days called Khorasan, which we would nowadays call Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, but then as now composed of savage, bloodthirsty warlords busily chopping each other up. And east of that, the growing and enormously important Mughal Empire, which brought India to the status of a world power for the first time, again something which you might say is again happening now 400 years later for different reasons. So that's the world of that period. We have to in a way exclude China and Japan, which were leading such sealed off lives that it's difficult to join them into that common story. But the rest of this world shows us something which I've been finding increasingly important to write about, which is that even though we may think of our cultures as being very separate from each other, they are not. You know, that then as now, all these little boxes that we think we live in opened up into all the other little boxes, and that you can't understand any of them without reference to the others. You can't understand what it was like to be an Ottoman Turk without understanding the presence on your eastern frontier of the Persian Empire and on your western frontier of Renaissance Europe. All of these things affect each other. There was great trade. I mean, the European Renaissance, this extraordinary peak of Western culture, was in large part made possible by the interactions with the Muslim world. Venice was receiving commissions from Turkey and from the Middle East, and those the Sultan in what became Istanbul, and the various pashas and so on in the Levant, as it was then called, they would commission Venetians to make their rugs and their furniture and their glassware, because they knew that actually the quality of craftsmanship was very high in Venice at the time. But the patterns and designs and so on were often stipulated by their own cultural and artistic traditions. So you find the way in which, if you look at Renaissance rugs and plates and glasses and things like that, these are often closely based on Islamic designs because of the connections. Deep. There was, I don't know if any of you saw last year, there was a show at the Metropolitan Museum here, which was about Venice's interaction with the Muslim world, and it was very clearly physically demonstrated there by showing you the objects and the way in which the patterning and designs were closely influenced by their connections with the East. So it's very interesting to study this period because it shows us that the kind of feeling that has often developed in not just in Western culture, in Eastern culture too, of if you like, mutual distrust and the sense of being each other's other. You know, that was true then. I mean, it was true in the Crusades. It's getting to be true now. But if you really look at the way in which human history has in fact really worked, it's not true. What is true is that these worlds have been profoundly interpenetrated always, and that each of their achievements is in part the result of their interaction with the other side. So you have to see it in that way, and I think to look at the world that way, whether we're talking about the 16th century or the 21st, is, I think, a useful antidote to a lot of the other stuff that we're fed. I'm not trying to say that it's a didactic book, because actually I don't like books that wag fingers at the reader and say, here's how to think. Well, not novels anyway. I think, the art of the novel is to tell a story and to draw the reader in and to allow the reader to draw their own conclusions from the story that they're told. So that you won't find in this book any kind of neon signs saying here's the contemporary relevance. But if you find it, I mean, it's almost certainly there, because after all, I'm writing from a position now. So my concerns also are the concerns of people living now. And in a way, the book wouldn't have been written if it hadn't been for that fact, because why do it? I mean, why go back to the 15th and 16th centuries to find a novel? And I mean, my answer to that is partly that, I'm a historian by background. I mean, that's to say, when I was at college, I did not study literature, which is a great blessing, because otherwise I would probably have ended up being a critic. The lowest form of life. Somewhere slightly below the amoeba. It's a very interesting, there's a wonderful passage in Samuel Beckett's play, Waiting for Godot, when Vladimir and Estragon are insulting each other, and their insults get increasingly vicious, and the ultimate insult, the one that ends the argument, is critic. So, this is a view held by some writers, I don't know why. Anyway, sorry, how did I get there? What was I talking about? What was I talking about? History, exactly, not literature. Not literature, and the thing about the study of history, I mean, of course, you forget a lot of the history that you study at university, but certain things remained with me. One of them was a rather wonderful thing that one of my history professors once said to me. He said, you should never write history until you can hear the people talk. And because he said, if you can't hear them speak, you don't know enough about them and you can't tell their story. Which is actually, by the way, excellent advice for novelists too. But what he means about the study of history is that it's, getting the dry facts is not very difficult. Finding out what happened here or there, and what were the principal exports of Florence, and who went to war with whom, and who was Pope and why, and so on. I mean, all that stuff it's relatively easy to get that. What is much harder to do is to enter the mindset of people who lived in another age and who really did not think as we think. And it's not just a pre-Freudian age. It's an age in which, for instance, the shape of the world was only just coming to be known. This is the period of the discovery of the New World. And if you think about how strange that would be, I mean, for instance, Christopher Columbus lived and died without ever realizing that he'd come across a new place. He thought that he had reached the Indies, and he never was disabused of that idea. The idea that this was a new continent eluded him. And this is one of the reasons, I'm going to make a little speech in defense of Amerigo Vespucci. Amerigo Vespucci gets a very, very bad press. And a certain amount of this is entirely justified, because he was, is it fair to call him a liar? Yes. It is fair to call him a liar. Certainly, in terms of the first voyage, on which he claimed to be the pilot of the ship and to tell everybody where to go. That's almost certainly not true. I mean, he probably was on the ship, but in a much more menial capacity. In no sense one of the leaders of the voyage, but just went home and wrote the book, and managed through the power of literature, to inveigle himself into a leadership role. However, the thing that Vespucci did see, if he was not the first person to see it, he was one of the very first people to see it, was that something different had happened, that this was not where they thought they were going, that this was what he called mundus novus, the new world. It was, and you had to just take it as that. You could not assume that the world was the shape it had been. I mean, if you think about the explosion this would have made in the 16th century mind, 50 years before Columbus, the view of the world was the following: that if you sailed west from Europe across what was then called the Ocean Sea, the first thing that would happen is that giant monsters would rise up from the deep and eat your boat. Very, very big, boat-eating sized monsters would rise up from the deep and swallow you, right? So that would be a problem. And if you could get past the boat-eating monsters, which, by the way, you couldn't, but if you could, you would discover a point at which the ocean would turn to mud, and your boat would then be stuck in the mud, and would be unable to proceed. Now, if your boat could proceed past the boat-eating monsters, which it couldn't, and then go through the mud, which it couldn't, your prize for that would be to fall off the end of the world. Okay. So that is how people thought of the world just a generation or two before Columbus's first voyage. And then they discovered all these spectacular things. I mean, by the time Columbus sailed, there was a pretty good assumption that the world was round. So it's not true that he discovered that fact. I mean, he sailed in the expectation that the world was round. He just thought it was a much smaller globe. And imagine the discovery that the world in which you live is twice the size that you think it is, and that it's not the shape you think it is, that there's a whole landmass, there's this giant continent whose existence you've never suspected. This is the radical, sort of existential change that is taking place in the minds of people in Europe in the 16th century. And to re-enter that cast of mind, it's a revolutionary cast of mind. And in many ways, you could say that we are living in a revolutionary time too, when we're beginning to see new shapes of things and the world, and there's a parallel there, perhaps, in the way in which the really dramatic change in worldview that is happening now, is not so unlike what must have been happening in the minds of Western Europeans when they discovered the existence of the New World. I mean, actually, there's an interesting story about this. The first time the word America is ever used, was on a map which is known as the Waldseemüller map. It was made by a monk called Martin Waldseemüller, who was he was living in a monastery in southern France. And he gathered together all the best contemporary knowledge about the voyages to the West. And he drew this extraordinary map. The thing that's extraordinary about it is that it's really very accurate. And it's not only accurate about the east coast of the Americas, it's actually one of the first times that the west coast of the Americas is really accurately depicted. So it becomes quite clear that these are continents and that there's water on both sides of them. And at the top of this map, as figures dominating creation, are the figures of Ptolemy and Amerigo Vespucci. It's interestingly not on North America, but on basically the northwest quadrant of South America, so Brazil over towards Peru. The word America appears for the first time. And Waldseemüller asked about this, said that surely a man who had made such a colossal, world-changing discovery deserved to have his name on a piece of the world. So hence America. Now, interestingly, as time went by and people became more and more suspicious of Amerigo Vespucci, Waldseemüller became less convinced of the grandeur of Vespucci's achievement. And in a later edition of the map, he took America off the map and replaced it simply with the words Mundus Novus, the New World. But, you know, the genie was out of the bottle. You could, once you've called something America, you can't uncall it America. But that's how it happened. I mean, that's how it happened. And as I say, I would defend Vespucci only because he really was one of the 2 or 3 people who first popularized the idea that the world was this new shape. You know? And so what I'm saying is you live in this world where the world is changing at enormous speed. And that is true now, and it was true then. And to examine how people looked at that world then might give us some clues about what we're doing now. You know, for me, I'm going to talk for about 5 or 10 minutes, then we'll talk about whatever you guys want to talk about. You have these 2 cultures at a kind of pinnacle. That's to say, the Europe of the High Renaissance and the India of the High Mughal Empire. These are pinnacles of philosophy, of art, of architecture, of music, in all kinds of ways, and also of power. And actually, the subject of power itself is very important in both places. I mean, you know, Machiavelli did not write The Prince at this period by accident. The point is that you have in Italy at this period these princes, the princely houses like the Borgias and the Medicis and so on, so ruthless, so powerful, and yet at the same time patrons of the arts and so on, so powerful that even the papacy becomes, if you like, a battleground between the great families of Italy. And sometimes there's a Medici pope, and sometimes there's a Borgia pope, and so on. And the papacy, by the way, itself is a major military power. So you have religion militant in those days. Again, maybe one could see some similarities with the present day. The Pope riding into battle at the head of his armies. I mean, an extraordinary sight. The armored Pope. Can't see it with this one really, but but you know, maybe the one before you could see at the head of an army. Interestingly, at this exact moment, the moment at which the book is set, there was in fact very little direct contact between Western Europe and India. There's very little in the record suggests that there was much going on. The Portuguese had established their small colony in Goa, so that was there. Vasco da Gama had arrived in South India at the end of the 15th century, and so the spice trade had begun with what was then called the Malabar coast of India, now called Kerala. But in the huge landmass of North India, the Indo-Gangetic plain, where the Mughal Empire was, there was almost nil contact. There is evidence of 1 or 2 merchants, 1 or 2 travelers coming from the west into the Mughal kingdoms, but no evidence of much journeying in the other direction. The best evidence there is that actually 1 or 2 of the queens of the Mughal court were quite considerable entrepreneurs. I mean, in fact, the main queen of the Emperor Akbar, Mariam-uz-Zamani, who was actually the mother of his heir, Prince Salim, who took the name of the Emperor Jahangir, she had a whole fleet of trading vessels, and they would trade as far as the Red Sea in her own name, not in the name of the king. So she was in her own right a sort of powerful merchant. And so when you think of the women of the East as being shrinking violets, this is not entirely true. For instance, there was one of the aunts of the Emperor Akbar, Gulbadan Begum, decided suddenly that she wished to go on a pilgrimage to Mecca. Unheard of for a woman just to set off, you know. And to make it difficult for the emperor to refuse her, she managed to persuade kind of half the ladies of the Mughal court that they wanted to go too. And so he had to give in. Gracefully or ungracefully is not revealed. And they went off on this 2-year journey. Now, for a bunch of noble women in the 16th century to spend 2 years journeying from India to Mecca and back, it's an extraordinary act. But it shows the adventuresomeness of many of the women of this period. And so I thought that if I could come up with an adventuresome woman, it would give me a way, fictionally, of doing the thing that didn't happen in fact, which is to join these two worlds and see what happened. And so I have this story of this princess of the Mughal house who, partly by accident, partly by becoming a spoil of war, and then partly by making choices not to go home again, but to stick around with the Shah of Persia because she finds him attractive, and then dump him when she finds somebody better, and so on. It would give me a way of sending her across the world, and having a story at the heart of which was this intrepid female character who becomes the bridge between the worlds. And I had a couple of clues about, which gave me permission to do it, if you like, that if you read Orlando Furioso, the great narrative poem by Ariosto, which was written in Ferrara, in Italy, at more or less exactly the time I'm writing about. It's set earlier. It's set in the time of Charlemagne and so on, so it's set several hundred years earlier, but it's being written at exactly this moment. And the plot of Orlando Furioso is, amazingly, about an Indian princess showing up in Europe and creating havoc, and being accused of being a witch, enchantress, etc., and being improbably called Angelica, great Indian name. And she's, of course, the geography is all screwed up because Ariosto really doesn't understand anything about it. So she's called the Princess of India and Cathay, wherever that is. But never mind, there she is. To my amazement, there I am trying to invent an Indian princess arriving in Europe, and he's done it 400 years ahead of me, which was comforting, because it showed me, if he can do it, so can I. Always good to be second. A lot safer. Vespucci was second, Columbus was first, etc. And meanwhile, over in the Mughal side of the story, there's a true story about the first Mughal emperor, Babur, the grandfather of Akbar, when he was still being essentially a warlord before he had established the kingdom in India. There was a point where he was besieged in Samarkand by one of his rival warlords, a man called Shaibani Khan. And Shaibani Khan told him that if he wanted to save his neck, if he wanted to have safe conduct out of Samarkand, he had to surrender his famously beautiful sister, Khanzada Begum. And so he did. And actually, in his autobiography, he's rather embarrassed about this. When he writes about the retreat from Samarkand, he says, unfortunately, as we left Samarkand, my sister Khanzada was lost. He doesn't say, I handed her over to save my own neck, because that would perhaps not have been entirely manly of him. And she actually stayed with Shaibani Khan for the next 10 years, actually had a child by him. And then he, in his turn, was defeated by the Shah of Persia. And the Shah of Persia, Shah Ismail I, wanted to have good relations with the Mughals, and so he sent her home. And she actually came back had a respected old age at the Mughal court as one of the grand old ladies of the court, and that's what really happened. But I thought, well, it doesn't have to happen, does it? And so it gave me a clue. I thought, here's a woman beginning to move west, and here's another woman in Ariosto's poem arriving in the west. And so it's as if I found myself with two ends of a bridge. And I thought, if I could build the bridge somehow, then I've got a story. And so that's the story. And it's full of witchcraft, because I guess this is the last thing I want to say before opening up to questions. The other really interesting thing about the difference of worldview between then and now is that the thing people most profoundly trusted and believed in was magic. I think you could even argue that they trusted and believed in it more than Roman Catholicism or Islam or Hinduism or whatever, because magic was seen as an everyday, useful thing, in the way perhaps that we would now see, I don't know, science or medicine. But for them, it was the occult world. The occult world was seen to interpenetrate the everyday world in a completely everyday way. So that, if you fell in love with somebody and you wanted her to fall in love with you, you got a love potion, obviously. You know? And if there was somebody you didn't like who you wanted to do down, you went to somebody to put a hex on them. And so people would use magic in this very commonplace way, in the way that you'd go and get yourself, a pill if you needed to cure some ailment. And interestingly, very often in the Renaissance, magic was believed to reside in women more than men. That's to say that the figure of the witch is much more in the imagination of the Renaissance than the figure of the wizard. The figure of the enchantress more than that of the enchanter. If you look at the paintings of the Renaissance period, they return over and over and over again to the subject of the enchantress. There's dozens of paintings of different supposed sorceresses and witches. And the thing that's most remarkable about these paintings is that if you go 50 years back from that in European history, the witch is always depicted as being ugly. The witch is always depicted as being hunchbacked, hook-nosed, warty, boil-ridden, kind of like, like Snow White's horrible stepmother when she disguises herself and shows up with the apple, And that, if you look in the early part of the 15th century, that is the kind of standard portrayal of the witch. And what happens at this moment in the High Renaissance is that image is replaced by the image of the witch as beautiful young girl. Suddenly, the enchantress is being portrayed as voluptuous, naked, loose-haired to depict her loose morals and so on, in settings, sylvan or urban, but very, very, very gorgeous. Suddenly, the gorgeous witch, the seductress, the temptress, the enchantress, enters the mindset of medieval Europe. The erotic power of women is joined with this other secret power, if you like, and creates an image of womanhood which is, on the one hand, if you like, potent, but on the other hand, of course, very dangerous for women. Because the point about the seductive enchantress is that your people's attitude to such a person can spin on a coin and turn into a hatred of the witch. And of course, this did lead often in the history of Europe to witch burnings, to witch hunts, and so on. And I mean, Marina Warner, English writer, once writing about this, pointed out that if you think about the apparatus that witches are supposed to have, the witch's hat, the familiar, like a cat, the broomstick, often the witch's tit, the third nipple. As she says, almost all women of the period would have had in their kitchen a broomstick. Very many of them would have had a cat. The pointed hat was a perfectly normal piece of fashion wear for the period. And so basically, by saying that the defining characteristics of the witch are the hat, the broomstick, and the cat, you're basically making all women potentially into witches. And the only thing that remains is the accusation, somebody pointing and saying, witch. See? And then, the Witchfinder General, for instance, in England in the 17th century, used to test witches by weighing them down with stones and throwing them into a pond. And if they drowned, they were clearly innocent. And, and if they floated, they were guilty. And so they needed to be burned. So it was a, tough one to get out of that. So here is this sort of knife edge on which many women stood in this period. On the one hand, the sexual allure and the kind of almost fearful admiration of the enchantress, and the flip side of that coin is the destructive force of male power unleashed through the accusation of witchcraft. So that's the knife edge on which the story of this girl who travels from the east to the west stands. And to find out any more about it, you will have to read the book. So let me stop there, because there's a lot of you here, and there's more people. Have they gone? There were some people there. No, I've obviously chased them away. But okay, let's have some questions, and there are microphones, as somebody said, and please go to them and ask me stuff. Thanks.
Did you find when you were doing research you had a big problem with just getting distracted and sort of chasing off down useless little rabbit holes and having to actually drag yourself away and go, that's fascinating, but I don't need it? This is one of my problems when I'm online.
Yes. I mean, one of the things about research is that it's enormous fun, And you do find out all kinds of stuff that you can't quite believe that it's true. And yet it is. And so you do go off, as you say, down these rabbit holes, and you do have to be very disciplined. I mean, there was given the amount that I read, it would have been very easy for this book to be 900 pages long. There's loads of stuff. But I had to keep telling myself, disciplining myself into thinking, only include what serves the story. If it serves the story, it's in. If it doesn't, if it's a distraction, no matter how interesting a distraction, it must go out. There were some things, however, that I discovered that were too good to leave out. I mean, for example, there I am charting this woman's journey across the world, and at the point at which she gets into Turkey on her, and falls in love with this Italian soldier of fortune, who is at that point working as a mercenary for the Turks. They fall in love, and that's how she ends up. He brings her back to Italy, and that's what completes her journey. But at this moment, she's actually in Turkey, Ottoman Turkey. And I discovered, reading about that period, 1453 is when the Turks conquered Constantinople and established the Ottoman Empire. So the second half of the 15th century, the Ottoman Empire was consolidating itself. And in this period, probably their last great enemy was Hungary, and one of the allies of Hungary was Romania, and in particular the prince of the southern province of Romania, Wallachia, who was in fact Dracula. Now, it's one of the things that is wrong about Dracula is Dracula was not the Prince of Transylvania. Transylvania is the northern province of Romania. That's Bram Stoker's fault. He did that. Dracula was the Prince of Wallachia in the south, which is the province which had a common frontier with the Ottomans. This is Vlad II Tepesh, the Impaler, Vlad Dracul, the Dragon. No evidence that he was ever a vampire. But given how bloodthirsty he was, I think, vampirism would have been a relief. I'll tell you, there's one surviving journal of the Ottoman campaign against Dracula, which was written by a Serbian janissary. Janissaries were kind of like the Marines of the Ottoman army. Serbia, and many of them were from other countries, either captured and retrained or else serving as mercenaries. Anyway, this Serbian janissary called Constantine wrote a diary of the campaign against Dracula, which has survived. And there's a passage in the novel which is drawn more or less directly from it. He talks about a moment when the Ottomans had besieged Dracula in this small town in southeastern Romania called Târgoviște. And they thought, okay, we got him now. We can go and reason with him. And so they sent a very big army against him in this town. And when they got there, they discovered that he had planted around the town a stockade of 20,000 sharpened stakes, on each of which a human being had been impaled. Not because they'd done anything wrong, just to scare the approaching army. Just to say, this is what I do with people I don't like, so come over here and have some of that. And this extraordinary sight, 20,000 dead people impaled on stakes surrounding the town of Târgoviște, faced the Ottoman army when it arrived. And it worked. It scared the pants off them. And they said, we're not going over there. That dude is mad. And they retreated. So, you come across a story like that, and you think, look, okay, it's a slightly a side alley, but it's going in. so yeah. Yes, right. So.
Forgive me my strange phrasing. I'm extremely nervous talking to you. So after you wrote the Satanic Verses and the personal implications that it had, do you feel that your writing style has changed in that you're subconsciously censoring yourself, or do you feel that sort of life has been the same and your writing has continued how it was?
That really quite well expressed my point of view. No. I think if you read any of the stuff I've written, whether fictional or nonfiction, since that time, I don't think I hope you don't see any evidence of self-censorship in there, because I think, actually, for me, that's a terrible thing to do to yourself as an artist, you know. And if you take your work seriously, I would sooner not write than to feel that I was in some way circumscribed in what I could write, what I could imagine and express. So, no, it actually made me more obstinate, is what it did. You know, I think if somebody's trying to shut you up, you know, the best thing to do is not be shut up. You know, and if possible, speak louder. You know, and better if possible. But I mean, that was really, I discovered in myself a capacity for obstinacy, which I had not previously suspected. And it kept me going, you know. So, thanks. Oh, well. Later. Sorry.
Mr. Rushdie, it's a pleasure to have you here. I think you have more people here than when Batali was here a couple of days ago. Nicely done. Midnight's Children I read in college, fascinating book. They said English Patient couldn't be made into a movie. Have you been approached about making that into a film?
I've been approached a number of times, and we got very, very close once. But it never happened. I mean, the closest we ever got was that I guess must be 10 years ago, around 10 years ago, the BBC wanted to make a kind of miniseries. They wanted to make like a 5-hour miniseries of it. And I thought actually that was maybe even better than a movie, because the problem with the novel is it's very, very, very long. And it's a novel that takes place over 65 years. And movies are not good at at talking about the elapsing of long periods of time. You know, whereas a television series that comes out, you know, once a week or something, there is a kind of time lapse automatically built in. You know, so it allows us. So I thought anyway that would be a good way of doing it. And they had a script written which nobody liked, and in the end I wrote a script for it, which people did accept, and it was going ahead. And actually we had it fully cast. We were going to film in Sri Lanka. We had a full crew in place. And we were 1 week away from principal photography. And at this point, a whole series of terrorist attacks broke out in Sri Lanka. I mean, you know, Tamil Tiger attacks. And it became clear that a major English television production in Sri Lanka could become target. And so there was a real concern about that. And in the end, because of that, you know, tragically, the plug was pulled. I mean, literally, it felt like having a Concorde on the runway and have it take off and just crash at the end of the runway, you know. And the problem with that is there is this thing which you may or may not be aware of called political insurance, which films can take. It's quite expensive to get, but it insures a film production against, you know, acts of war or terrorism or, you know, political upheaval, which make it unwise to continue. And so they were able to claim the political insurance, and therefore they didn't lose money. But it kind of makes the project uninsurable. You know, once you've claimed the political insurance, you go to another insurance company and say, could we please reinsure? They kind of look at you strangely, you know, because the insurance company had to pay up, I don't know what, you know, $2-3 million, you know, for the work that had been done up to that point. So that's what happened. I mean, it's kind of sad because it really was ready to go. And I mean, in many ways, the worst thing that can happen to you as a writer is wasted work. You do all this work and nothing happens. In the end, it wasn't quite wasted, because a couple of years after that, the Royal Shakespeare Company in England expressed a desire to do it on stage, Midnight's Children. And so we actually used the scripts that I'd written for TV and reworked them into a 3-hour stage show. And that did go on in England. And actually, part of the money for it was put up by Columbia University. And so it actually came here and was at the Apollo Theater, amazingly. I never thought I'd get to play the Apollo, you know. There actually was one night when they wanted me to go and have an onstage conversation about the play after the show with somebody. So I actually did get on the stage. I actually did play the Apollo. And it was great for them, they said afterwards, because they had I mean, the reason for the Apollo is that Columbia, Lee Bollinger felt that it was a way for Columbia to have some sort of outreach into the local community, and that was a good thing, I think. But there was a problem which we overcame, which is that there was a great fear that, you know, the Apollo had never done straight theater. And the problem was, would the theater audience go that far uptown? and there was a genuine concern that it wouldn't. And since the thing played to sold-out houses, it's actually told the management of the theater that if they actually have the right show in there, they can do it, and the audience will come uptown. And so they were actually very pleased with that discovery. And the hard thing is that because it's not a theater built for plays with scenery and props, the backstage almost doesn't exist. You go off stage and there's about this much. There's nowhere to put anything. And if you've got props to rush on and off stage, where do you put them? So we actually had to have trucks outside the theater on both sides, opening into side stage doors. We used to rush furniture on and off the stage into the trucks. So if they're really going to have to do more theater there, they are going to have to think about that. But so that's as close as it came. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I saw the show at the Apollo. It was great.
But you saw it?
Yeah, you also did the preview at the Guggenheim with Works in Process, right?
No, the Guggenheim thing was a different thing. The Guggenheim was that Charles Warren, the composer, made an opera out of Haroun and the Sea of Stories.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, sorry.
And it was shown at the Guggenheim in the Works in Progress series there.
Works in Process.
And yeah, that's right. And then they did the opera at the City Opera.
Right. Yeah. Listen, going back to the beginning, it was great when you were talking about how useful the stuff we do is. I certainly hope it's more useful than the very useful magic that you were talking about later. I have some ancestors who were burned as witches, and I'm hoping that my end of the family working in this particularly useful business does better than they did. But I wonder if you can tell me, what could we as Google do to be even more useful to you than we are now? What could we build? What could we fix? What problem could we solve that we haven't already addressed? How can we serve you better?
Well, I mean, I think we see one of the problems that does exist is that a lot of this scholarly material, which is the stuff that was particularly useful, is protected. I mean, let's say it's in the way that sort of as we're in the old print world, not everybody gets to go into a university library and study. I mean, it's there for the use of scholars doing serious work, and using that same picture of the world, most university scholarly texts are, password protected, and they're behind kind of screens which are difficult to get access to. Now, I mean, I think it's a big question and probably too big to go into in much depth here, because I have on the one hand, it's clearly a good thing that there should be better access to this kind of scholarship, and that requires making sure that people are properly compensated, protected, et cetera. And I do have great worries about some of what Google has been proposing in terms of making available online all in copyright work, because the work I'm talking about is long out of copyright. That these Persian texts and so on. I mean, they're common property anyway. But when you start talking about works in translation, I mean, again, the issue of compensation arises. This could, in theory, destroy the publishing industry. And I don't want to sound alarmist, but it actually could, if it's not properly worked out. I mean, the answer is that you can't say that we don't want this technology. What you have to do is find a way that's fair of doing it. And the thing that worries me about putting in copyright work on the net is that, I mean, I know that stuff can get hacked into. It's one thing to say, of course, we'll have everybody's copyrights guaranteed and protected, and people will be properly compensated. But everything gets hacked into. And if you suddenly find popular books being made available in pirate editions on the web, which happens already in the book world. I mean, in India, all my books are pirated. You go, if you're driving around in Indian city and your car stops at a traffic light, little children come up with heaps of books saying, please, interesting book. Sir, see, Rushdie, see, Grisham, see, Dan Brown. And I mean, I have not been paid the ultimate compliment where your name is put on books you don't write. That does happen. They buy some cheap thriller and they put Dan Brown's name on it, and it's better than his real books. But the problem, Midnight's Children, for instance, was so extensively pirated in India at the time that it came. I have no idea how many hundreds of thousands of copies were sold in illegal editions. It got to the point where the pirates were so thrilled that they started sending me greetings cards. I would get these cards that said, "Happy birthday," signed "The Pirates," etc. I just think that that's a problem. How do you safeguard legitimate publishing from being stolen and made available for free round the corner? Right now, I find approximately once a week, I find whole text editions of the Satanic Verses, Midnight's Children, and other books available on various internet websites. And my agents have to go and try and take them down. But it's already happening before everything's been digitized. That there are people putting this stuff, scanning the pages, putting this stuff online illegally for free. And so I think we just need to work this out. I think one can't deny the future. I'm not a kind of Luddite figure. I'm in favor of all this new stuff. But if it ends up being done wrong, it will do enormous damage to the world of books. And if it's done right, it can exist very happily side by side. So that's. I think there's just that. It's not quite the question you asked, but it's the kind of bee in my bonnet right now. Thanks. Yeah.
My question is more related to your writing process. So in researching, you must come across many details and little bits of color that you hope to put into or weave into your book. When writing then historical fiction, how do you add in those details, or
you just have it in your head. A lot of the architecture is just in your head. I do have all kinds of notes and stuff, but the truth is that when you are deeply inside a book, there's this enormous kind of matrix-like construction of connections that you really just have to hold in your head, because there's no other. Your head's the best computer available. You know what I mean? It's the thing which can make the connections and links and so on, and hold them in the most complex way. So a lot of it is just there. Again, it's the local color and all that. That's relatively easy. As I say, the difficult thing is to stay inside an alien way of thought, because really you're trying to bring to life human beings from then, rather than transplant into the past people who feel like human beings from now. That would feel kind of dumb. If you have people there thinking and acting like contemporary people, it would feel fake. So that's the greatest problem, is how to create characters who are engaging and involving, and that you want to know their story, but who actually have a cast of mind which is not yours, which belongs to another period. For instance, there's some wonderful stuff. For instance, in Florence in this period, I'm not making the following thing up, okay? Male homosexuality rose to so high that both the state authority and the church began to fear for the population. The birth rate was in danger. And their solution to it was brothels. So what you had was the city authorities, with the full support of the Catholic Church, the Vatican, setting up state-sponsored brothels, very large ones, in downtown Florence, the purpose of which was to persuade boys that girls were cool. Right? That was it. And if you look at the court records of Florence in this period, there are almost no prosecutions for prostitution. Almost zero. The only ones, the 2 or 3 that you will find in the court record, are prosecutions of prostitutes who, as the court says, agreed to have sex in the male fashion. Right? That was not okay, because that's what they were trying to tell people not to do. But apart from these 2 or 3 prosecutions for sodomy, there essentially is nothing. It was completely accepted and actually thought to be a social good to build whorehouses. Now, you can't make that stuff up. If I made that up, people would have a go at me. But actually, it happens to be true. So the world is a much stranger place. That's the great thing of discovery. The world is 10 times as strange, 1,000 times as strange as you can believe it to be. And that's the fun stuff to find, you know. But you end up using a tiny fraction of the material you discover. I mean, it really is like the tip of the iceberg, you know, because otherwise you're writing a history book, you know. And my interest was to tell a story. So that's the difference. People ask me quite a lot already about what's the difference between writing a history of the period and writing a novel about it. You know? And I think the difference is that what history doesn't let you do is to get inside human beings. You know, what a novel, the art of the novel is a thing which allows you to feel from the inside the lived experience of people whose lives are not like yours, you know, whose lives are in a different place or a different time and a completely different class or world, you know, and yet you can feel like them. You can feel what Anna Karenina felt, you know, you can feel what Madame Bovary felt, you know, and you can feel it not because you're told, but because you experience it from inside the character, you know. And I think that's, if you do it right, that's what literature can do. It can give you the world. You know, you can read a book about Latin America. I mean, when I read Garcia Marquez, I had never been to Latin America, you know, but reading those Latin American writers, I felt like I had been. You know, reading Gogol and Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, I felt like I knew something about Russia. You know, and this is the art of the thing, is that if it's done right, it gives you access to worlds which are not your world. You know, and it's a great thing. Speaking as a reader, that's a great thing.
Thank you.
Thanks.
So we're about out of time,
Okay.
but Salman has graciously offered to sign some books afterwards, so let's all thank him for coming.
Thank you. Oh, look, there it is. Thank you. And look, they're there. They didn't disappear. They're still there. Hello, people. All right.